Our guest today on Dairy Business Update is a longtime industry leader who, we might say, in some ways is better known around the world than he is here in the U.S. cattle breeding industry. John Schouten is the veteran CEO of Worldwide Sires, based in Visalia, California, which has become the international arm of Select Sires. We'll be asking John to speak about not only some of the highlights of his career, but also more broadly about the global acceptance of U.S. dairy genetics. John, welcome. Glad to see you.
Thank you, Joel. Glad to be part of Dairy Business Update today. Thank you.
Well, I'm looking forward to the conversation. John, you started with the company some 35 years ago and working with, at that time, with the founder and owner, Bill Clark, a prominent Holstein breeder based here in California. What was your first job with the company, and what was it like then to work internationally, kind of before the U.S. dairy cow became the featured dairy cow of the world?
Yeah, Joel, thank you so much. You're right. It was 35 years ago I came to Hanford, California. I had graduated from Cal Poly 4 years before in dairy science, went home to the home farm in Southern California, so I had some practical experience, but had the opportunity to become at Worldwide Sires as a marketing assistant. And I was grateful for those 4 years of practical experience I had on the farm because it helped me then and later in terms of understanding what happens on the dairy. But it was a much different world when I came, and I had no international experience. So Bill Clark and Rich Denier and the others there at Worldwide Sires at that time took a risk on a young guy that liked the dairy industry but had no international. And Bill told me, he said, John, if you love the dairy industry, if you like being with people, and you're interested in the international exposure, there's nothing better. And I can tell you after 35 years, he was exactly right. What I really appreciate and respect about Bill Clark, and we take it for granted today because in today's world with the smartphones and everything is instantaneous around the world. But when he started the company 50 years ago, and certainly when I came on 35 years ago, we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have computers, heck, we didn't even have faxes. And so the communication, how to work with people in the whole process was completely different. I remember sending letters out and take 2 weeks to get there and 2 weeks to get back, and then you figured out what you had to do. And if you had an important message, then you sent it out by telex. So a lot of ways, and so I really respect that Bill had this global vision about how to put things together. And they also gave me the opportunity to go to German language school, which I really appreciate because I was a marketing assistant for probably just about 6 months and then moved into an area director marketing role. And I covered then the German-speaking countries, which was very important then because we take English for granted. But as you said in the beginning, really, I have not spent that much time doing business here in the United States at all, except for industry meetings. It's been 100% focused on international. So the German language was helpful for speaking in many countries. You got to remember this is still part of the Cold War era. So if you go into Eastern Europe, and heck, even one time I had a tour group from Japan that was here in California, and they had a bus, and nobody spoke English on the bus. And so we tried to figure out how to communicate, and I just by chance said, well, does anybody here, sprechen Sie Deutsch? Anybody speak German? And sure enough, there was. So it has become practical even outside of Germany and Eastern Europe. But the aspects of that, of going around to the different bull studs in those days to talk about genetics and what was going on in the United States was very creative by Bill and others. So Bill worked to get all of the U.S. AI cooperatives together for all the areas outside the Americas. That was the traditional Worldwide Sires territory. Actually, up until this year, that's changed. We've now also included Latin America into that, but for the last 49 and a half years, let's say, it really was outside the Americas. And we have to appreciate that the Europeans was really our main target, especially in the early days of the business. But there was a lot of let's say, uncertainty in Europe about did they make the right choice. So we all know that the first Holsteins came from the Netherlands, came from Germany, let's say the middle 1860s or somewhere in there. And I still remember being in Leeuwarden in the Netherlands at the herd book office, and they showed me, the official documentation that showed these are the cows that got exported to America. And in the late 1960s, Dr. Wilkie from Osnabrück and Dr. Roth from Hanover got together and you have to keep in mind there's about 50 German AI studs at this time as well, but they see this time for transition. And they were the ones that imported Pabst Ideal from Wisconsin to Germany. At the same time that Elevation was making a very big impact here in the United States. And I would dare say actually Elevation really is the one that opened up the door as they saw the difference that happens with the US selection practices versus what was going on in Europe at the time. And it wasn't easy. In some countries, let's say the next door neighbor, the Netherlands and from Germany, Bill Clark was not welcome in the country in the early days. In fact, the associations didn't want him in the country, and they said, please don't come and please don't send your product. We don't need it. They were one of the last to change, but once they changed overnight, and they realized they'd made a mistake. And so what we see today practically around the world really is the Holsteinization acceptance of the North American Holstein and breeding programs. But even, 35 years ago, it was still questionable whether all those things would kind of be like they are today as we understand them.
And we had the dual purpose breeding in Britain and Italy and France, particularly. Not what we would consider the pure dairy cow.
That's exactly right. And so as the breeding changed, and so we've had things change in those countries that you just mentioned. I mean, Italy has been one of the best countries for U.S. genetics for many, many years. Of course, some of the famous herds of the time were imported directly as live animals into Italy, so they've always had a high acceptance level as such. And even today, the U.S. genetics are the #1 choice by the farmers in Italy, but certainly in other countries around the world and their acceptance of what the genetics can do. And so for me, I really like this because it gave me the opportunity to meet people from overseas that had interest in breeding, had interest in cows, and were helping to make better cows so they can feed their people. I mean, this is the thing that was critical. They could be more economically successful in their own countries. And we really see that today with all the data that's much more available and easily to assimilate today than in those days. But it certainly was a great acceptance coming on later for what that was. And just as a personal aside, so I grew up on a commercial farm, and of course I was very focused on, we had 2,000 cows at the time, and what our breeding program was, of course, we were looking for milk and production. When I think about that, and my first assignment was to go to Germany, which was the #1 exporter of live animals in the world at that time. And our customers were very interested in the U.S. genetics because of the superior type. So not only was it the production, but the type was important. And they knew that they had some of the best bulls. So I can think of some that maybe even people here in the U.S. might not remember very well. Because even back in the 1980s, a little bit negative on milk, but there was bulls like Spruce Edge Majesty and the Marvel bull from Sire Power that was available at that time. But they were so popular in Europe because of their outstanding type. And so I learned something in that process as well that, it's really important to understand what the customer wants before you start spouting off about what you think should be the solution for some of their problems or opportunities, in this case, as it may be.
Just as an aside, I think there are some U.S. breeders who would remind folks and remind AI people that that's the case here too, in terms of breeding goals.
For sure.
I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and on this topic of the development of the breeding industries in Western Europe, particularly, as well as Australia and New Zealand. With the use of U.S. genetics, they've developed some really outstanding genetics themselves, which they not only sell to their own dairymen, but also export, including some sales back to the U.S. How has that changed your issues and your strategies at Worldwide Sires?
Really good question, Joel, and you're exactly right. I mean, if we're doing our job, of course, then that will be the natural outcome of things. You're creating more competition. I still remember back when I started 35 years ago, and Bill Clark told me, he said, John, this will be, the great opportunity, but I'm not sure if we have 5 years or how long it's going to last before they catch up, pass us up, and this whole thing might be over. And I said, okay, well, we'll take that for the adventure that it is. And so here we are. But I believe, and you're exactly right, it's the U.S. semen and embryos that have helped these countries establish things locally. Um, but especially now with genomics, it is a different world. So if we go back to the period of time where things were getting started, of course, everything was based on progeny tests. It took a long time. You had to test bulls and you had to wait for data. Uh, this world is completely different today, primarily because of genomics, and we'll throw sex semen in there as well. But specifically on this point, it would certainly be on the genomic side. And so finding the bulls today is much quicker. Obviously, you don't have to wait the 5 years or whatever it might be to get the results. And the technology today of the farmers also is different. That has also helped farmers make decisions much quicker. In the old days, they had to rely on whatever information they could find wherever it was. And English was probably a more limiting factor than it is today. Today, so many people speak English. That's the one big difference I'll say I see from the time I started till now. And we forget, you know, in all of our countries, at least for most people, English is a second language. And sometimes though, we have more confusion talking with the English-speaking countries than the ones that aren't, making sure we understand each other. But specifically, the technology today and the education process about genetics and herd improvements, I think expectations of customers is different also. So it used to be, let's just talk about, you know, genetics, but I think also people are saying, well, I need more than that. I want somebody to help us manage our breeding program. We want to have some services. So that led actually also to the development of Worldwide Sires. Up into 2010, we didn't really have a service department, but we did start it in 2010 and continue with the Global Training Center up in the state of Washington. We have technical staff that help people. It started out primarily as reproduction, but also goes into management. But, you know, the thing is that because here in the U.S. we have such outstanding cows, such outstanding data, and so much of it, we best not take that for granted. It is really, for our country, one of the best things, and the transparency of it all. So I think that that really has been helpful for us. The best years, let's say for sales, if we're going to talk about it from that perspective, actually happened. Our two best months in the history of Worldwide Sires actually were two of them during the pandemic. And I believe that part of that has to go, one of our mantras has been, you know, culturally making sure we take care of people and building relationships. So April last year was an incredible month for us as people weren't sure what was going to happen. So we had, you know, runs on toilet paper and runs on different things. Well, there was a run on bull semen too, actually, across the seas because, you know, we didn't know if airplanes were going to fly or what that meant. But also, we had the one that passed it up actually was December of last year, where actually we're getting the breeding season and goes on. So, and the thing is, people see these results in their country, and that speaks volumes. So in the early days when Bill set this up, I mean, you had to, a little bit, you're selling dreams because people have to wait a long time and try to see what comes of it. The consolidation of the industry happened here in the United States already. There's really one AR, artificial insemination cooperative that's left here, that's Select Sires. But around the world, we see the same thing happening. So in Germany, where there was many co-ops, there are a lot fewer. But also we're now seeing international alliances between co-ops happening and consolidation. So recently there's a consolidation between the co-op in France, Germany, and Denmark. And I just think this shows how expensive this business is. And so to the question that you had raised about, you know, the competition, is certainly we're cognizant of that, but it's much more expensive game today than it was before. So, and the cost of distribution, people don't really think about that, but Worldwide Sires now with over 50 years and the experience of setting up the networks and all the rest of it, there's huge expense in getting international distribution. So you think about all the costs of research and development, obviously that's true, but also in setting up the networks. And then all of the fun of, you know, all the things that happen in between that are different with our friends overseas. And that's, I'll just digress, Joel, for this part, because one of my favorite things is there's no 2 days the same here at Worldwide Sires, and especially with international. You just, you know, but I come back to what has kept me so interested and excited for these last 35 years is this love for the cow that, and you know, you don't have to speak the same language, you don't have to have the same culture, but there's some kindred spirit, really, there is, between dairy people around the world, that there's just this common bond. And it makes, because of the cow. And it just brings us together in a way we wouldn't have otherwise. I think it's maybe the understanding of the life cycle of what happens. We have a special appreciation. And as we get fewer and fewer people involved in agriculture and the dairy industry globally, you grow to appreciate that experience of it all. And I'm really grateful for that part of it and the everyday way that that has impacted me personally.
In terms of your 35 years of work, and on this topic of your personal connections, how many farms do you suppose you've been visited outside the U.S. in your years with Worldwide?
I'll tell you, Joel, that is a really difficult question to answer. I don't know, actually. I should have probably done a better job of keeping it. I can't even tell you how many probably countries I've done, but I did keep track of one thing that was maybe peculiar, but I know that I've made 240 overseas trips in the last 35 years. And most of those were to Europe, but obviously Australia, New Zealand, throughout Asia, Middle East, North and South Africa. I've enjoyed, obviously the opportunity to be on some of the real large dairies in Saudi Arabia, just to see what that is. And I actually did, I used to go there every year when I first started, and then for a long time I didn't go, but I went back last year, and it's just really great to see in Saudi Arabia how, with the dairy industry, who really is primarily using U.S. genetics as their source, and you can see the quality of cows that happens with production and long-lasting and economic viability.
Well, after your time as general manager at Worldwide Sires, back in 2001, Select Sires bought the company, and you were named a general manager at that point. New job, new owners, new boss. How has your personal, professional transition been through the changes that you've worked on?
I've enjoyed every step of the way. What I really appreciated during the Bill Clark era was the entrepreneurial spirit of the company. Bill was an entrepreneur. He loved the industry, he loved the people part of it. And I told Bill when he sold the company in 2001 that I hoped as long as I was here we could keep that spirit still alive and what the new piece would be. So, and I hope that's still true today. In 2001, Bill sold the company then as a joint venture to what was then Select Sires and Accelerated Genetics. So there was a change, obviously, in how, who I reported to. At that time, because it was a joint venture and they were not two companies yet, they were still two companies, not one combined, the board was consisted of the CEOs. So I owe really a debt of gratitude to Roger Ripley, who's the retired CEO at Accelerated, Dave Thorbaugh, the CEO at Select Sires, who's still there today. But those were the two that I reported to. They had their CFOs and the farmer board president. The simplicity of it was, sometimes we aligned and sometimes we didn't. But it was very clear for me what our purpose was to sell as much product as possible overseas to help bring money back, to help subsidize the research and development for the bull programs or whatever else was needed for the organization to go forward. Because really that's what International, I think, did, was to help make those programs less expensive here for the farmers in the United States. So there was actually still one more transition in all this in 2018 when Accelerated became part of Select Sires. And the Worldwide Sires board changed at that time as well. So 8-member board now, and there's 6 farmers from out the United States coming from the Select Sires board, as well as Todd Kranz, who's the Chief Development Officer, and Chris England, who's the Financial Officer at Select Sires. So that's who we report to now. My personal feeling is the company really, we've all been good in different ways, but the focus now of really combining as one company and figuring how important international is for what the benefits are, what the company's all about, is actually right now. And we take a look at that, and as a result of that, now there's 10 wholly owned subsidiaries that Worldwide Sires, Select Sires have in different countries. But obviously we have a very important distributor network that's even more numerous than that. And certainly there's some places like in the Middle East where we have worked direct to the farm for many, many years, and those all continue in that way. But when I started in 2001, I was a 40-year-old guy thereabout, and it changed from one day to the next. And so I thought, what do I do? What do I say to the staff? And we had more countries to work in than we had people on staff, right? So I I came up with something simple, but I held to it, and I would say actually it's going to be one of the last things I remind everybody when I leave here in June, not to forget this, because I think it's helped us in many ways. And number one was always take care of the customer. And by that, that means we need to understand how to walk in the customer's shoe. And that's going to be different things in different places. So listening to what they say is really critical. And, you know, so some of my, I've traveled a lot, so I don't mean to sound arrogant or something, but to some of my real close American friends, I have to tell them for just a minute, stop thinking like an American and start thinking more international into the approach. I think that just helps you to walk in their shoes a little bit. But number two was to take care of each other, because I believed as a team, we had so much to do that we had to have each other's back. And I think part of the success of the organization really is the fact that, you know, we've got people who are just dedicated, so passionate, and really want to have success for the people that we work with. But there's a lot to do. So we got to make sure we help each other when there's things that get done, and it doesn't matter whose job it is. Let's make sure we're helping each other through the process. And number three, stay focused. And making sure you're prioritizing what it is that has to get done, and you come back to number one and number two again, and then you go back to number three, because it just helps you to continue to grow. And in the early days of 2001, you have to keep in mind that Worldwide Sires at one time, up until the end of Bill Clark's era, had all of the cooperatives as suppliers. So huge supply. Well, some of those things changed when the ownership changed, and so therefore there were some shortages for what we had for supply. I will tell you, it was some of the most difficult days of my life. But today, I am so grateful that I went through those, because it forced us to ask questions about, you know, who are we? What are we doing? Does anybody care? And how best do we take a look at this in terms of the processing what our goals are, and making sure that we have the right products and services and the right approach to the marketplaces. So every once in a while, I remind our team here about that as well. Those days were so helpful, because you can't take things for granted, and you never want to become so stale that you just keep doing everything you do. And especially today, it's especially true. Things are going so fast. So we've constantly got to ask ourselves, are we doing the right things? And if so, making sure that we're taking care of our customers, and then also bringing our whole team along in that process.
Well, John, I think that's a great way to kind of wind up our conversation here. Time is of the essence, I'm sorry to say. I think there's a lot more we could talk about. I'd be really interested in hearing about some of your work with breeders offshore, and some of the great bulls that you've worked with, and some of the bulls that were great for offshore customers that, as you pointed out, weren't particularly well known here in the U.S. And that's a whole nother story. But we congratulate you on your career. We know that your successors in the management role will have big shoes to fill. You've always had a great team at Worldwide Sires, and I compliment you for that too. So we've enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you, Joel. Appreciate it very much, and enjoy being part of the discussion today.
And this is Joel Hastings for Dairy Business Update, which can be found at dairybusiness.com.